The arrow was meant for the Alpha King's son. Lyra knew it the moment she saw the silver glint in the afternoon light, the way it cut through the air with a purpose that no stray bolt could have. She was standing at the edge of the ceremonial courtyard, a basket of healing herbs pressed against her chest, just another Omega servant no one bothered to look at twice. The boy was 5 years old and laughing. He had broken away from his guard. They always did at that age, always thought it was a game. And he was running toward the fountain at the center of the courtyard, arms stretched wide, oblivious to the whistle of death coming for him. Lyra dropped her basket and ran. She didn't think. That was the truth of it later when people asked. There was no calculation, no weighing of her own life against his. She simply ran because the child was going to die, and she was the only one close enough to stop it. She hit him low, wrapping her body around his, and the arrow buried itself in her left shoulder instead of his small chest. The pain was white and enormous. The courtyard exploded with sound, guards shouting, steel scraping against scabbards, the child crying into her neck. Lyra held him tighter, pressing his face away from the chaos, her breathing ragged and shallow. "Shh," she managed. "You're safe." "You're safe now?" The voice that cut through the noise was not loud. It didn't need to be. King Cailan of Vorthan spoke at the volume of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, and the entire courtyard stilled. "Bring her to me." Lyra had heard stories about the Alpha King. Everyone in the lower wards had. He was described in terms usually reserved for weather, something vast and impersonal, capable of destroying everything without malice, simply because destruction was its nature. They said his eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they said this as a warning, not a compliment. They had not mentioned how still he was. He stood in the center of his guard, his young son now retrieved and clutched by a frantic nursemaid, and he was utterly, terribly still. He watched Lyra being helped to her feet by 2 of his soldiers, the arrow still jutting from her shoulder because no one had yet been brave enough to touch it, and his expression gave nothing away. But he watched her. He watched her the way a man watches something he cannot yet name, but knows on some level below thought that it matters. Lord Draven appeared at the king's left shoulder like a shadow that had learned to wear silk. He was the king's uncle, the royal regent of the Eastern Territories, and he had the kind of face that inspired immediate trust. Broad, open, framed by silver at the temples. He had governed Vorthan through a decade of the king's grief and isolation, and he did it with such apparent devotion that no one ever thought to question him. "A servant girl," Draven said, his tone a careful blend of dismissal and mild approval. "Brave, I suppose, in the way that simpler creatures are brave. We should send her to the healer's ward, Your Majesty, and reward her family appropriately." "No," said the king. "Just that. One word." He stepped forward and his guards parted before him without being asked, and he stopped in front of Lyra. Up close, the stories were more accurate. His eyes were the color of a winter sky. But there was something else in them, something the stories had missed. Pain, old and deep and carefully concealed, like a wound that had never been allowed to properly close. "Your name," he said. Lyra's shoulder was screaming. The edges of her vision were going soft with blood loss, but she held his gaze because she had spent her entire life being looked through by people who should have looked at her, and she was not going to look away from the first person in years who appeared to actually be seeing her. "Lyra," she said. "Lyra Ashe. I'm a healer Omega in the lower ward." Something shifted in his face. It was barely perceptible, the way a glacier might shift, not visible in the moment,
but capable of enormous consequence. "Not any more," he said. He turned back to his guard captain, a man named Tirrick, whose jaw was currently doing an impression of a dropped drawbridge. "She comes with us to the Vorthan seat. See to her wound personally. If anyone impedes her transport or her care, I will hear of it." "Your Majesty." Tirrick's voice was careful. "She's an Omega, unranked. The court will have questions. Let them ask me," said King Cailan. He walked away. He didn't look back, but Lyra had the strange, inexplicable certainty that he knew exactly where she was. The seat of Vorthan was called the Ash Crown, and it deserved the name.
It rose from a plateau of dark stone, all sharp towers and severe lines, built by a king 3 generations past, who had apparently believed that architecture should express the soul of its owner. The current king had not changed it, which told Lyra something about him before she had even crossed the threshold. She was housed in the East Wing, not the servants' quarters, not the dungeons, but a set of rooms that were larger and finer than anything she had ever occupied. There was a fire already burning when they brought her in. There were flowers on the table, the kind that bloomed in the mountain passes, that no one should have known to get for her because no one knew she loved them. Someone had guessed, or been told to guess. She didn't know which was stranger. A woman came to tend her wound, not a healer slave, but a proper physician who removed the arrow with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times and felt nothing. She stitched the wound and said little, and when she was done, she left. Then Mira came in. She was a young maid, barely 17, with red hair and an expression of barely suppressed excitement that she was doing a poor job of suppressing. She set down a tray of food and immediately turned to look at Lyra with wide, wondering eyes. "You're the one," she said, "who caught the arrow for the little prince." "The arrow caught me," Lyra said tiredly. "I just got in the way." Mira shook her head. "They're saying the king claimed you." "I don't know what he did." "He brought you here?" Mira sat on the edge of the bed without being invited, which was exactly the kind of thing Lyra had always loved, and other people had always resented about her. To the Ash Crown, no one comes here who isn't invited, no one stays who isn't claimed. That's just how it is. Lyra looked at the ceiling. Her shoulder ached with a deep, bone-settling throb. "Then I suppose I've been claimed," she said. She met the king properly on the 3rd day, in a room that was all dark wood and tall windows and nothing soft. He was standing when she entered, which she hadn't expected. He had a map spread across a table in front of him, and he glanced up when she came in, and that was that. The room immediately felt smaller, the way all rooms must have felt smaller to him when he occupied them. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he folded his arms across his chest and settled back slightly, which she interpreted, correctly, as a form of permission. "You know who I am," he said. "The Alpha King of Vorthan," she said. "Cailan of the Ash Throne. You've ruled since you were 21, after your father's death. You have one child, Prince Eden, born of a mate who passed 4 years ago." She paused. "I'm a healer. I learn about people. It helps." "What else have you learned?" She met his eyes. "That you're in pain, and that it isn't grief." The room went very quiet. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. The way a man changes when he has been seen in something he thought he had hidden. "Sit down," he said again. This time she sat. He pulled out the chair across from her and lowered himself into it slowly. And there it was again, that slight catch in his movement. the careful calibration of a man managing constant discomfort. She had noticed it the first day. She had been trying not to think about what it meant. "The frost vein," he said. Lyra's breath stopped. The frost vein was a curse from the old wars, a weapon made of black sorcery that entered the blood like ice, spreading slowly through the body's channels, stealing warmth and strength and eventually the ability to shift. In the stories she had read, it killed slowly. It killed completely. "How long?" she asked. "A year, perhaps. Less if the cold months come early." His voice was completely even. She wanted to hate him for how even it was. "The royal physicians cannot halt it. The southern magic healers say it is beyond their art. I have—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I have accepted it." "Then why tell me?" He looked up, and for the first time she saw something in those winter eyes that wasn't controlled, something urgent and raw, quickly shuttered. "Because you healed the physician's stitching in your sleep," he said. "She told me. She said the wound she closed should have needed 3 weeks by morning. It was sealed, not scarred, sealed." Lyra said nothing. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I've read about your kind, golden vein healers, born with warmth in their blood that can mend what ordinary healing cannot. They were hunted 3 generations past. Most of them are dead." He paused. "Are you the only one left?" She didn't answer. Which was an answer. "I'm not asking you to save me," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm asking you to try. I'm asking you to stay here, in safety, with access to everything you need, and try. If it fails—" He looked away. "At least Eden will know I searched for every option." Lyra thought about the little boy laughing in the courtyard. She thought about his small hands gripping her arms and how he had not cried until he was safe, which was the bravest thing she had ever seen a 5-year-old do. "I'll try," she said. Something crossed the king's face that might, in another man, have been relief. It started with her hands. She would press her palms against his back, where the frost vein had concentrated its cold, and push, there was no better word for it, push the warmth in her blood outward. It exhausted her in ways she couldn't fully describe. It felt like pouring from a vessel she hadn't known had a finite supply. But it worked. Not a cure, not a reversal, but a slowing. She could feel the ice in him receding slightly at her touch, retreating like a tide going out, and he would breathe differently afterward. Deeper, looser, like a man who had been holding his shoulders at his ears for so long he had forgotten how to let them down. He never said thank you. He said other things. He said, "You should eat more before these sessions. You look like you're fading." He said, "Mira tells me you slept in the chair because you didn't want to mess the bed. That's absurd. Sleep in the bed." He said, one evening when she was sitting on the floor after a session with her head tipped back against the wall, "My wife used to do that. Sit on the floor when she was tired. She said floors were honest." He said it like he was testing the words out, like he hadn't said them aloud in years and wasn't sure they still worked. Or was she? Lyra asked. "Honest, I mean." "Completely," he said. "It was exhausting and wonderful." She smiled at the ceiling. "I understand that." He was quiet for a long moment. "You are also honest," he said finally. Disconcertingly so. "It's a healer thing." "Is that what you call it?" She turned her head to look at him. He was watching her, and he didn't look away when she caught him, which told her something she hadn't had a word for yet. "I call it a survival technique," she said. "If people know exactly what you think, they can't use the truth against you as a weapon." Something moved in his face. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. I need to learn that, he said at last. Very quietly, almost to himself. Lyra looked back at the ceiling. The warmth in her chest, she decided, was probably just the fire. Lord Draven came to see her on the 14th day. He came alone, which was unusual, and he came to her rooms without announcing himself, which was ruder still. He sat in the chair by her window and crossed his legs at the ankle, and he smiled at her with the full force of a face that had learned over decades to radiate trustworthiness. "You've been good for him," Dravon said. "I want you to know that I see that. You've brought him back somewhat. He eats more. He attends his councils. It's quite remarkable what a little warmth can do." "Thank you, my lord," said Lyra, and said nothing else. She was watching his hands. Healers always watched hands. His were too still. "I do worry," Dravon continued, "about his future, about Vorthan's future. You understand that the court will need to see stability, an heir, eventually, of the proper bloodline. There is a woman, Lady Seraphine of Morn, who has been considered a match for some time. Excellent family, strong blood, very suitable." He smiled again. "I merely mention this so that you can calibrate your own expectations accordingly. You are valuable to him, certainly, as a healer." "As a healer," Lyra repeated. "Precisely." He stood, smooth as water. "I would hate for a misunderstanding to cause you grief. You've been through enough by all accounts." He left. Lyra sat for a long time after, her hands folded in her lap, the warmth in her blood, very quiet. Then she went to find Mira. "Tell me everything you know about Lord Draven," she said. Mira looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down and began to talk. She didn't tell the king what Draven had said. Not yet. She had no proof, only the chill she had felt in the man's presence that had nothing to do with the frost in the king's blood and everything to do with something rotten underneath a polished surface. She needed to be certain. Healers knew better than anyone that a wrong diagnosis could kill. But she watched. She watched the way Draven positioned himself at council meetings, always to the king's left, always slightly behind, feeding commentary at moments chosen to create maximum influence. She watched the way he deferred to the king's face and directed from the king's blind spot. She watched, and she remembered, and she kept her mouth shut. Then Lady Seraphine arrived. She was everything Draven had described and a few things he had diplomatically omitted. She was beautiful in the way of cold things, perfect, immovable, polished. She walked into the ash crown and immediately took up space as if she had already measured herself for the throne. She looked at Lyra once, in the way one might look at furniture. Then she turned to the king with a smile that knew exactly how good it looked and said, "It's been too long, Kaelin." Lyra watched the king's face carefully. He was polite. He was gracious. He was also, she had come to understand, a man who had learned to wear graciousness like armor when he wanted to keep a distance. That evening, during their session, he was tense in a way she hadn't felt in weeks. The ice in him had surged forward slightly, responding to his stress, and she had to work twice as hard to push it back. "She's going to stay a while," he said, unprompted. "So I gathered." "Draven arranged it?" He paused. "I did not ask him to." "I know," she said. A longer pause.
"How do you know?" "Because you would have warned me," she said simply. "You're considerate when you remember to be." He turned his head, and she caught his expression before he could school it. Caught the unguarded look of a man who had not been considered in a very long time and didn't know what to do with the experience of it. "Lyra, don't," she said very gently. "We don't have to name it. Not yet." He was quiet. Then, for the first time, he reached back and covered her hand where it rested against his shoulder. His hand was cold, always cold, because the frost vein stole his warmth from the outside in. But the pressure of it was certain and deliberate and warm in every way that mattered. They sat like that for a long time until the fire burned lower and the night pressed in at the windows. Neither of them moved. The trap came on a moonless night 3 weeks later. It was clever. She gave Drevon that.
A message written in Mira's hand because someone had stolen the girl's writing from her letters and copied it, that said she had found something important in the lower archive and needed Lyra to come alone, quickly, and tell no one. Lyra should have known. She did know somewhere in the back of her mind, even as she pulled on her cloak and slipped out of her rooms. But Mira was her friend, and she had learned early in life that the fear of being wrong was less powerful than the fear of leaving someone she loved alone in danger. So she went. The archive was deep in the castle's underbelly, cold and lightless, and there were 4 men waiting for her. She got 2 of them with her power before they managed to bind her wrists in iron, cold iron, the kind that pressed against a healer's skin and dimmed the warmth in her blood like a door closing. The other 2 held her, and Lord Drevon stepped out of the dark. He was not smiling. "I tried to be reasonable," he said. "I offered you an accommodation. You didn't take it." "You offered me invisibility," she said. "It's not the same thing." "You are a complication," he said, the warmth entirely gone from his voice now, something flatter and older underneath it. "The king is dying. He was supposed to die on schedule, and the throne was supposed to pass to me as regent, to my son after me. Everything was arranged. And then you appeared and started slowing the curse down. And he started looking at you like—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "It cannot continue." "You poisoned him," she said. "The frost vein isn't natural. Someone cast it." "Someone had vision," Drevon said. "You've been killing him for years and calling it loyalty." "I've been building Vorthan's future for years," he said, very calm. "Kaelin has always been too soft for the throne, too emotional. He grieves too long and loves too hard, and that makes him weak. A strong kingdom needs a strong hand." "He is the strongest person I have ever known," she said. Drevon looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite contempt. It was sadder than contempt, which somehow made it worse. "Then you're a fool," he said, "and fools don't survive courts." He raised his hand. The warmth in Lyra's blood surged. It had been building since the iron touched her wrists, compressed and growing hotter, like steam in a sealed vessel. She had never done what she was about to do deliberately. She had never had a reason to push the warmth outward with anything other than care and precision. She let go of precision. The cold iron cracked. It cracked along the seams first, then split, falling from her wrists in 2 pieces, still frost-white on the inside from the cold that had tried to hold her. The men holding her stumbled back from the heat she was radiating. She could feel it now, the power in her skin like standing too close to a forge, something vast and unnamed and wholly her own. One of the guards ran. The other 3 were smarter than they looked and ran faster. Drevon stood his ground. She had to give him that. "This changes nothing," he said. "You can't prove any of it. My word against a healer Omega's. I've served this kingdom for 15 years. "You cast the curse," she said. "It's still in him. And I've been inside the curse for weeks, feeling its edges. I know your signature in it, the same way a healer knows a hand she's touched before." She raised her chin. "That's not something I'll have trouble explaining to a court." Something flickered in his face, the first real fear she had seen there. "Caesar!" he said. There was no one left to seize her. He reached into his robes instead, and Lyra was already moving, already pressing her power outward in a wave of gold-edged warmth that hit him like a wall. Not to hurt him, she was a healer. She didn't know how to hurt, but she could expose. The warmth stripped away the ambient cold of the curse he'd been carrying with him, the echo of his own spell, the residue of black sorcery that clung to a caster long after the casting. And it lit him up like a lantern in a dark room. The doorway above them exploded inward. King Cailan came through it like a man who had already decided what he was going to do, and was merely performing the formality of arriving. He was followed by Tyrick and 6 members of the king's own guard, and all of them stopped when they saw the light. They all saw Dreven. They all saw what clung to him. "Nephew," Draven said, and his voice held something that almost sounded like genuine regret. "This is not—" "Don't," said the king. One word, like all his words, absolute. He was looking at Dreven with an expression Lyra had never seen on his face. It was not fury. It was something colder and more complete, the look of a man dismantling a structure he had trusted for years, brick by brick, and finding rot in every one. "Take him," he said to Tyrick. Then he crossed the room to Lyra. He took her face in both his hands, his cold hands, the frost-ravaged hands of a man who had been dying by degrees for years, and he looked at her with those winter eyes, and they were not controlled. They were not controlled at all. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she managed. "You went alone. You didn't tell me." "I didn't know for certain. I didn't want to accuse—" "Next time," he said, very quietly and very clearly, "you tell me. Whatever you suspect, whatever you fear, you tell me. Do you understand?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Next time implies there will be a next time," she said. "There will be a next time," he said. "There will be 1,000 next times. I'm not releasing you back to the lower wards, Lyra Ashe. I don't have I cannot." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I need you to stay." "Cailan." "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know all the reasons you shouldn't. I know what the court will say and what the law requires, and all the ways it is politically inadvisable. I don't care about any of it. I need you to stay." The warmth in her chest had absolutely nothing to do with her power. "Okay," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the warmth from her skin seeped into him slowly in the dark, and somewhere behind them, Tyrick was making a very professional effort not to be visibly moved. He was not succeeding. The trial of Lord Draven lasted 4 days. Lyra testified on the 2nd day, standing before the full court, with her wrists still faintly red where the cold iron had scored them, and she spoke in a clear, steady voice about everything she had observed, everything she had felt in the Frost Veins signature, everything Dreven had said in the archive. He denied it, of course he denied it. Then the court's own sorcerers examined him and found the residue of the original casting still clinging to his hands, exactly where Lyra had said it would be. After that, he stopped denying it. Lady Seraphine left Fortharn before the verdict was read, which told everyone everything they needed to know about her level of involvement and her preference for self-preservation. Commander Tyrick, who had spent the past month watching Lyra with the wariness of a man who didn't trust anything he hadn't personally verified, appeared at her door on the 3rd day of the trial with a bowed head and the longest, most formal apology she had ever received. "You don't need to do this," she told him. "I misjudged you," he said. "I do need to do this." She thought about it. "Then I accept," she said. "And I'd like it noted that I am also somewhat difficult to trust on first meeting, so you were not entirely wrong." He looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize as his version of deeply relieved. "Join the club?" he said, almost to himself. "We apparently all have matching symptoms." The healing came slowly. With Draven convicted and the curse no longer being actively maintained, it had begun to fracture on its own. Great cracks spreading through the ice in Kaelin's blood, the way spring comes to a frozen river, not all at once, but in stages, in small surrenders. But the roots of it were deep, years deep. Lyra worked on them every night, her hands pressed against his back, or his chest, or the inside of his wrists, where the cold had gathered thickest, her power seeping into him like sunlight into stone. It took everything she had. By the end of each session she was hollow with exhaustion, propped against the headboard of his bed because she no longer had the energy to walk back to her rooms, and he would sit beside her and make her drink broth and tell her with the patient repetition of a man who had decided this was going to be his job now that she needed to eat. "I'm fine," she would say. "You're translucent," he would say. "That's a very dramatic way to say I look tired." "You look like you're trying to disappear," he would say, quieter. "I need you to stop doing that." She would look at him in those moments and see something that had not been there when she arrived. Something warm and specific and entirely focused on her, like a man who had locked a door for a long time and was only now remembering that he had the key. One night, near the end of a session, his hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his chest. "Lyra," he said. She waited. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "It's been 4 years since I had anyone to—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at the soft things, the saying of it. I don't have the words for most of what I feel." "You don't need words," she said. "I think I do," he said. "I think you deserve them." He turned to look at her. In the firelight, he looked less like a winter sky and more like the moment before dawn, still cold, still vast, but with the suggestion of something coming. "I love you," he said, as though he were stating something he had been observing for some time and had now reached a conclusion about. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Possibly the moment you sat on the floor in my study because you were too tired to ask for a chair and you just decided the floor was acceptable. Or possibly earlier. I suspect it was earlier." Lyra looked at him for a long, aching moment. "It was the broth," she said. "I love you because of the broth." He stared at her. "I was weak from the healing, and you personally went to the kitchens and brought me broth," she said. "And then you sat with me while I drank it, and you pretended you were reading a dispatch, so I wouldn't feel watched. You pretended very badly, for the record. But the effort was—" She stopped. "It was everything," she said. "You are everything." He put his arms around her, very carefully, as if she was something he was not yet accustomed to holding. She pressed her face into the warmth at his neck, and the cold in him receded another fraction. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. For the first time in 4 years, Kaelin of Vortharn watched it through the window without feeling the ice move in his blood. It was gone by the first moon of winter. Not diminished, not managed, gone. The court physicians confirmed it on a grey morning in the council chamber, with Lyra sitting beside the king and Tyrrek standing behind them both, like a man who had decided this was his post now and intended to hold it indefinitely. The senior physician examined Kaelin's blood with every tool he had 3 times over, and when he looked up, his expression was the precise mixture of professional control and personal awe of a man whose entire medical understanding had just been revised. "There is no trace of it," he said. "The king's blood is entirely clear." The council chamber erupted. Kaelin did not look at the council. He looked at Lyra. She was looking at the ceiling with her lips pressed together, and there were tears on her face, and she was doing the tight-shouldered thing she did when she was trying very hard not to cry in public. "You can cry," he said quietly. "You're allowed." "I'm not crying," she said.
"Lyra." "I'm celebrating," she said, very wetly. He took her hand under the table, and she turned her palm up and gripped his fingers, and neither of them let go. The ceremony was held a month later. Not a winter ceremony. They had enough of cold in Vorthan, and Kaelin had enough of it in his memories. They waited until the first thaw, until the snow pulled back from the mountain passes and the passes ran with meltwater, until the sun came back to the plateau with something approaching warmth. Lyra wore a gown the color of the golden vein light she produced when she healed. Not white, not red, but a deep, burnished gold that the court seamstresses had initially presented as an imposition and come to regard as the best work they had ever done. She had flowers in her hair, the mountain pass blooms that someone had put on her table on her very first night here, and she had never mentioned that to Kaelin. But when she came out of the dressing rooms and he saw her,
he looked at the flowers, and something passed across his face that told her he remembered. He remembered everything she had come to understand. He was the kind of man who noticed quietly and filed things away for later, and later had a way of arriving exactly when it was needed most. She walked toward him through a crowd that had been skeptical and was now something else entirely. She walked through Lord Dreven's empty space at the king's left and filled it with something different. She walked toward a man who was no longer cold, who was no longer dying, who had stopped being a winter sky the moment he decided to let the dawn come, and whose eyes now contained something that looked very much like spring. "You're not going to trip," he said quietly as she reached him. "I know," she said.
"You look terrified." "I look determined," she said. "There's a difference." "Show me the difference." She took his hand. The warmth passed between them the way it always had, immediate, certain, as though her blood had always known the shape of his. And the court saw it, the faint gold light at the place where their palms met, and the sound that went through the assembled witnesses was not a gasp, but something softer. Tirek, in the front row, stood straighter. Mira, 3 rows back, was crying in a way that made no pretense of being anything else. Prince Eden, held by his nursemaid at the end of the aisle, strained toward them with the absolute certainty of a child who already knew this was right. The officiant spoke the words. Kaelin and Lyra spoke their answers. And when the ceremony asked if there were any present who would object, the court of Vorthan was silent. Not the silence of people afraid to speak,
but the silence of people who had watched a king come back from the cold and knew, in the way you know the sun after a long winter, that some things were simply and completely right. He kissed her in the full view of everyone, which was not the sort of thing he had ever done before, and she kissed him back, which was exactly the sort of thing she had always done. Around them, Vorthan began to thaw. 6 months later, on a morning when the mountain passes ran clear and the sun sat easy on the plateau, Lyra stood at their window and watched her husband review dispatches at the table behind her. He was reading aloud occasionally, the ones that needed her input, because he had decided early on that they would govern together or not at all, and he had made this declaration with such quiet certainty that the court had accepted it before they fully processed what he had said. Eden was in the corner, building something complicated out of wooden blocks, narrating his construction process to anyone who would listen. Lyra had her hand resting low on her stomach where the warmth had been gathering in a new way for 3 weeks now, a warmth that was not entirely her own. She hadn't told Kaelin yet. She was thinking of how. She was thinking about the arrow in the courtyard and the cold archive and the moment she had put her hands against a dying man's back and decided that warmth was worth spending. She was thinking about the way he had covered her hands with his that first night, deliberate and certain in the dark. She was thinking about how the worst days of her life had contained, somewhere inside them, the seeds of all of this. "You're being quiet," Kaelin said from behind her. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She turned around. He was watching her with his spring sky eyes, the dispatch forgotten in his hands, reading her face the way he always did, as though she were a map of somewhere he had been searching for a very long time. "I'll tell you tonight," she said. He studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, the slow, certain shift of a man who noticed everything and had just noticed this. And the smile that came was not his public smile, not his carefully managed expression. It was small and private, and entirely hers. "All right," he said softly. "Tonight." He went back to his dispatches. Eden's structure collapsed spectacularly behind her, and the boy announced this loss with the grief of an architect whose vision had exceeded his materials. Lyra laughed, and the warmth in the room had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with what they had built here in this harsh, honest place. Not in spite of the cold, but through it. A bond forged in crisis and kept in kindness, a love that had proved stronger than any curse. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way to the end. It means more than I can say that you spend your time with these stories and the people who live inside them. These worlds only exist because you show up for them, and I never take that for granted. If this one found a place in your heart, let me know in the comments. It genuinely helps more than you know, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. It is free, and it means I get to keep telling these stories for you. Until next time.